More people on earth today claim to worship Christ than claim to worship anyone else. So Christ is the chief reason for believing in the Bible, and you've heard me use before Matthew 24:35, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will never pass away. He's the only man who ever lived who foresaw his impact on all the rest of time. The only man who ever lived who could claim eternity for his words. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall never pass away. Well, there are 1,000 things we could draw from the Bible to support our belief that it answers our questions, gives us a right philosophy so we can behave right, because actions have consequences. But as you know, and we've talked about it, in recent times, some strange things have been learnt from nature, particularly the anthropic principle. I was reading recently that DNA in every one of our cells, of which we've got at least about 70 trillion, is it? Something like that. The DNA is 300 trillion times as compact as any computer can make knowledge. Now, have you got that? DNA in our cells, every cell, little diagram of what we're to be. Every cell's got it. But it is 300 trillion, not billion, not million, trillion. 300 trillion times as compact as the best computer can render knowledge. A Christian doctor recently went to Cuba. The government said, we want you to teach some of our leading men the background of the English Bible because we're having trouble with morality. So he's facing all these atheists, and he put on the blackboard, this sentence arranged itself. And the people looked at it and thought he was crazy. He said, well, you don't believe that, but now watch. And he crossed out the word sentence and he put in DNA. Because as every scientist knows, and most of you have read many times, DNA is a code. And every code must have intelligence behind it. You've heard of Francis Collins, who was in charge of all these scientists for nearly a decade as they worked on the genome. Did I mention to you that Time magazine, November 30, 2006, did I tell you that he had a debate with Richard Dawkins? And in that debate he said, the gravitational constant is so fine-tuned, if it was different by 1 in 100 million, there'd be no universe, there'd be no us. That's amazing, isn't it? Roger Penrose, a physicist of Oxford, he said the possibility of the universe coming about by chance is 1 in 10 billion to the 124th. Now remember, all the atoms in the universe are 10 to the 80th. 10 multiplied by itself 80 times. That's how many atoms there are in the universe. He said the possibility of the world coming about by chance is 1 in 10 billion, the 124th. Donald Page of Princeton Department of Research gave a similar figure. And Paul Davies, the Australian scientist, as I've told you, said it can't be a matter of chance, and he's not a Christian. So with all that background, one finds that it is sanity to believe and receive the Christian gospel. And only when you get there can you make much sense of the book of Proverbs. And you've wondered why I've taken so long to get to Proverbs. Because Proverbs on its own is very damning. When I read it, I think, boy, I haven't done that, I failed here, I failed there. You know, Proverbs is full of counsel on how to live, but Proverbs is like a set of laws, and unless you're motivated, you just don't do it. The only real motivation for behaving properly is that I know that God is mine and I am His. When we have that motivation, then we will obey God's laws. This book of Proverbs has been called The Laws of Heaven for Life on Earth. Billy Graham, for many years, has read Proverbs one chapter a day, so every month he's through the book. Open it at chapter 1, if you would. Tell you something I find very interesting about this book. This is the book that begins with a kingly man, mentions Solomon, and ends with a queenly woman. Any of you that are not married, make sure you read the last chapter. There's a description of the woman you should marry. So it begins with a kingly man and finishes with a queenly woman. It's okay, Maureen. Some men read it long ago and they did okay. Yeah, it's all right. But the interesting thing about this is that Solomon didn't follow his own advice. This book is full of warnings to young men because it's particularly written to young men. He wrote it first of all for his son, Rehoboam. And believe it or not, this king who had 700 wives, 300 concubines, had to be a genius or an idiot. Anyway, he only had one son. Can you believe it? It's as though God was playing a trick on him. You know, there are people in Saudi Arabia now who have 70 sons. Now. They do have more than one lady in the house, called a harem. But the man that wrote this book, who had 1,000 women in his house or houses, I don't know how he slept at night or whether he slept at all, but anyway, he had 1,000 women. He only had one son, and this book was written for his son. And here's the tragedy that is a warning for all of us who read the book. Solomon himself, who was once thought of as the wisest of all men, became an idiot. You guessed that when I mentioned the 1,000 wives, didn't you? He became an idiot. And his wives turned aside his heart, and he became an idolater and a terrible failure. And his son, who was feebly minded but strongly passionate, did everything wrong. So isn't it a tragedy, and yet isn't it a lesson, that this book of advice on how to live, the author didn't work for him because he was led astray by divers strange ladies. And it didn't work for his son because an example is better than precept. That's a hard saying for parents. Example is better than precepts. So all around Australia, every day parents are saying to their kids, do this, do that, and the kids behind their parents' back say, but you never did that. You never did that. Parents tell their kids not to drink and then they swallow down a bottle.